Welcome back, dreamers. I hope you're set it up to hear more disturbing tales. Before you drift to sleep, tell me in the comments from where you're listening from. I'd been looking forward to this off-road camping trip for a while. A chance to disconnect completely, get away from the noise of everyday life, and lose myself in the wilderness. I'd driven my SUV down a rough dirt path that wound through thick forest, pushing further into the unknown with each turn, finally stopping at a remote clearing that felt suitably removed from any trace of civilization. It was a perfect spot, isolated and surrounded by trees so tall and dense that they created a canopy overhead, filtering the last rays of evening sunlight into a soft green glow. After parking my SUV, I took a moment to walk around, feeling the crunch of gravel under my boots and breathing in the scent of pine and earth. The evening air was still, and the quiet was profound. The kind of deep, enveloping silence you can only find far away from human activity. I set up a small campfire, more for ambiance than warmth, and sat down beside it, taking out a bottle of wine I'd brought along. The fire crackled softly, the only sound besides the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze moved through the trees, and I settled in, allowing myself to fully absorb the isolation. As the light dimmed and stars began to appear overhead, I felt like I was in a different world, completely detached from anything familiar. The vast openness around me felt both freeing and slightly eerie, knowing there was no one around for miles. I took a few sips of wine, enjoying the slight warmth it brought, and let my mind wander, just listening to the sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft whisper of branches shifting in the night breeze. Despite the comfort of the campfire and the wine, there was something about the darkness pressing in from all sides that kept me on edge, a subtle reminder of just how alone I was out there. When I'd had my fill of the fire, I packed up, poured a bit of water over the remaining embers, and climbed into the back of my SUV to sleep. I'd converted the space into a makeshift bed with a sleeping bag, blankets, and a couple of pillows. As I settled in, I felt a wave of calm, knowing I was safely enclosed within the vehicle. I double-checked the doors to make sure they were locked, a habit I didn't usually think twice about, but one that felt more important out here in the depths of the wilderness. I glanced out the windows. The trees formed a dense, dark wall around the clearing, and the stars above were bright and scattered, illuminating just enough of the night to remind me of how isolated I truly was. The night was cold and still, and as I lay there in the quiet, every sound seemed amplified. The soft hum of insects outside, the occasional crack of a twig, even the subtle creak of my SUV cooling down from the drive. For a while, I just lay there, looking up at the ceiling, my senses alert despite the stillness. I was miles from anyone, protected by nothing but the thin metal walls of the SUV, and I couldn't shake the feeling of how completely alone I was. But that was part of why I'd come out here, to be truly alone, to experience the wilderness on my own terms. The wine made me drowsy, and my eyes grew heavy as I drifted off, feeling a mix of freedom and vulnerability. In the back of my mind, though, there was a quiet sense of awareness that I was cut off from any help if I needed it. I let that thought go as I slipped into sleep, surrounded by nothing but the dark expanse of the forest. Sometime in the night, I was pulled out of my sleep by a strange sound. At first, I lay there disoriented, unsure if I had actually heard something or if it was just part of a dream. My SUV was still, the dark interior illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering in through the windows. I listened intently, my senses now alert, but at first there was nothing, only the usual stillness that comes with being so far from anything or anyone. Just as I was beginning to relax, ready to brush it off, I heard it again, an odd, distant sound coming from somewhere deep in the woods. It wasn't a scream or an animal's call, but something stranger, harder to identify. The noise was soft but carried through the trees, like a faint chant. It wasn't quite singing, and it wasn't exactly yelling either, but some unsettling combination of both, almost rhythmic, as if someone were repeating words I couldn't quite make out. It was too far off to hear clearly, but there was an eerie, almost hypnotic quality to it that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up slightly, straining to listen. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind or an echo bouncing off the trees, but it felt too deliberate, too human to be mistaken for anything natural. I glanced around the clearing through the windows, half expecting to see movement in the shadows, but there was only the quiet, empty stretch of wilderness around me, illuminated dimly under the starlit sky. The chanting continued sporadically, fading in and out as if it were moving through the trees, and I couldn't tell if it was coming closer or if it was just my imagination. The forest, which had felt peaceful just hours earlier, now seemed vast and ominous, each tree standing like a silent witness to something unseen. I gripped my army knife, keeping it close beside me, trying to focus on the reassuring weight of it in my hand. The noise had me on edge, and even though I told myself it was probably nothing, there was something deeply unsettling about hearing another human sound in a place where I was supposed to be alone. After what felt like an eternity, the chanting stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the silence that followed felt even heavier, as though the forest were holding its breath. I waited, every nerve on edge, listening for any sign of movement or any indication that someone or something was nearby. The quiet was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel my pulse pounding as I strained to hear even the faintest sound. I tried to lie back down, telling myself that it was probably just someone else camping in the area. But the thought didn't fully convince me, and I lay there wide awake, too nervous to let myself drift back into sleep. The hours crawled by, each minute stretched thin by the oppressive silence around me. I kept my knife close and eventually dozed off, but it was a restless, shallow sleep, broken by every small creak and rustle that came from outside. Just as dawn was beginning to creep over the trees, I was jolted awake by a distinct, deliberate sound, a triple knock on the glass of my SUV. It was the kind of rhythmic, purposeful knock that only a human would make, and the familiarity of it sent a shock of adrenaline through me. Heart racing, I pulled the covers down slightly, and as I looked toward the window, I could make out the shape of a person, someone standing right there, leaning in, their face close to the glass. Instinctively, I let out a deep, guttural scream, not even a word but a raw sound, a desperate attempt to scare off whoever was outside. I must have surprised them because they stumbled back a step, startled, before turning and bolting off into the trees. I was left sitting there, my breath heavy and shaky, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I was hours away from the nearest town, deep in an isolated part of the wilderness, and I knew that I should have heard any vehicle approaching long before someone could have reached my camp. Yet, somehow, in the dead of night, a person had found me, approached my vehicle, and looked inside without making a sound. I felt trapped, my nerves on edge, too afraid to step out, but too tense to stay inside. I double-checked that the doors were locked, then fumbled for my keys, starting up the engine to have some sense of control, the sound of the SUV's hum calming me, reminding me that I could leave if I needed to. I kept the headlights off, not wanting to draw any attention to myself, and I sat there in the driver's seat, eyes scanning the darkness around the clearing, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees. The forest, usually a source of calm and solitude, now felt like it was closing in on me, each shadow shifting as if someone were hiding just out of view. I strained my ears, waiting for any sign of footsteps, a twig snapping, anything that might signal the person's return. But after what felt like an eternity of sitting in silence, gripping the wheel, nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself to settle down, but sleep was out of the question. My heart was still pounding, and every small noise from outside kept me on edge. As the first light of dawn finally crept over the horizon, I felt a faint sense of relief, though the unease lingered. I stepped out, scanning the area for any signs that someone had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed dirt, just the quiet, indifferent wilderness stretching out around me. I knew, though, that staying put was no longer an option. The idea of spending another night in that spot filled me with dread. I packed up quickly, moving through the clearing with nervous, purposeful energy, checking over my shoulder as I gathered my things. As I drove away, my eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the clearing, watching me leave. Even as I found a new place to camp, later that day, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The deliberate knock, the shadowed figure, and the eerie silence of the forest afterward. The solitude I'd once craved now felt like vulnerability, a reminder of how alone I truly was out there. Years ago, my parents decided to convert our garage into an extra-large bedroom. It was the kind of space that families end up using for just about everything. An all-purpose room that became both a storage area and a place for us kids to hang out. The conversion was done pretty thoroughly. The old garage door was removed, replaced by a solid wall with a single window, and a regular front door with both a doorknob and deadbolt lock. It looked and felt like any other room, but it still had that slightly separate vibe from the rest of the house, with the door leading directly outside to the driveway and the window facing an empty stretch of yard. At about 10 years old, this space felt like a small paradise. We'd filled it with old toys, a stack of board games, family photo albums, and an old exercise bike that no one used anymore. But the main attraction was the TV in the corner, hooked up to our PS2. It had become the perfect place for gaming marathons, and my siblings and I would spend hours there, surrounded by the comforting clutter. The room was both familiar and slightly strange, like a piece of the house that had been repurposed and given new life. That night, I had the house all to myself for one of the first times. My parents were out on a rare anniversary date, and my siblings were each away with friends or family. I'd never been home alone at night for long, and the quiet of the house had an almost unfamiliar feeling to it. As soon as everyone left, I grabbed some snacks, closed the door to the converted garage bedroom, and turned on the PS2, excited for a late-night gaming session. The room quickly filled with the soft hum of the console and the familiar glow of the screen, and I lost myself in the game, feeling the hours slip by. I could hear the occasional sound of the house settling, the faint creak of the walls expanding and contracting with the cool night air, but I'd gotten used to those sounds. The only light came from the TV, casting shadows across the room, flickering over the piles of boxes, stacked toys, and other stored items that had accumulated over the years. Every now and then, I'd hear a faint rustle from outside, probably the wind brushing through the trees or a stray animal passing by. The window and door led directly to the outside, which felt both thrilling and a bit nerve-wracking, knowing that anyone, if they wanted, could come right up to it without needing to pass through the rest of the house. Despite that, I was enjoying myself, the quiet making it feel like the world outside didn't exist. But as the night wore on, I started to feel the difference in the room's atmosphere, the heavy silence around me settling deeper. I kept playing, glancing every so often at the door, which was just a few feet from where I sat. With each look, I'd catch a brief reminder of just how alone I was, the darkness outside seeming to press up against the single window like it was trying to seep in. The house was still, almost too still, and I found myself straining my ears, listening for any hint of movement beyond the soft sounds of the game. I was young enough to ignore the unease building up, convincing myself that the odd silence was just part of being home alone for the first time. I kept my focus on the screen, the glow flickering over the room, and tried to push away the faint prickle of nerves. After all, it was just one night alone. What could really happen? It was deep into the night, and I was still glued to the PS2, completely absorbed in my game. The house was so quiet that it almost felt as if it were holding its breath, with only the occasional sound of the controller buttons breaking the silence. I was fully immersed, the hum of the console and the glow of the screen the only company I had, and the rest of the world felt distant. But then, somewhere in the background, a faint tapping noise caught my attention. At first I thought it was just part of the game's soundtrack or sound effects, so I kept playing, hardly paying attention. But as I progressed through the game, I noticed a rhythm to the sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Almost like someone was drumming their fingers. It was soft but persistent, too steady to be random. I paused the game, listening intently as the tapping continued, realizing it wasn't coming from the TV speakers but from somewhere outside the game. The noise was coming from the window, just a few feet away. The realization hit me hard, and my heart started to race as I pieced together what I was hearing. It sounded as if someone was outside, gently tapping on the window glass, the drumming rhythm continuing without pause. I stared at the window, squinting to see through the reflection cast by the light of the TV. The glass revealed only darkness, just the faintest glimpse of my own wide-eyed face staring back. My mind raced as I considered who could be out there, but the thought of anyone being outside that late, tapping on the window, sent a shiver through me. Before I could make sense of it, the tapping stopped abruptly, only to be replaced by a rattling sound at the door, as if someone were trying to open it. The doorknob jiggled once, twice, and then more forcefully, as if whoever was outside was testing it to see if it would give way. I felt a surge of panic, every instinct telling me to check the locks. The door was just steps away, and I knew it had been unlocked. With trembling hands, I crept over to it, trying to stay quiet as I reached out to check the locks. Sure enough, both were unlocked, something I rarely thought twice about during the day, but suddenly felt like a major oversight. I fumbled with the locks, pushing the bolt in and twisting the knob lock until both were secure, hoping the noise of the locks clicking into place would deter whoever was outside. I stood there, my breath shallow, listening for any sign that the person would leave. But instead of leaving, I heard a low, gruff chuckle, like an amused response to my attempt at securing the door. The sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The rattling became louder, each shake of the doorknob more insistent, as if testing my resolve. And then, in a voice rough and taunting, the man outside spoke through the window. "Let me in, love. I'm cold and hungry. Don't you want to be nice to your neighbor?" His words were muffled by the glass, but clear enough to send a wave of fear through me. The way he spoke felt wrong, like he was toying with me, taking pleasure in my panic. I barely breathed, hoping he wouldn't hear me inside. The tapping resumed at the window, louder this time, and I could feel my heart pounding as I took a shaky step back. In the silence that followed his words, the room felt smaller, and the walls seemed to close in around me. As soon as I heard the man's voice taunting me from outside, my whole body went cold. I froze, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe, listening to every sound. The tapping on the window persisted, each tap more deliberate, as though he was waiting for me to respond, savoring the fear he knew I felt. My mind raced with what to do next. I could feel the weight of the darkness outside pressing up against the window, with the man's shadow lurking just out of view. The house felt both too quiet and overwhelmingly loud, every creak amplified as my heart pounded in my ears. Realizing I needed to get away from the door and window, I flicked off the TV, plunging the room into pitch blackness. In the silence that followed, I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound, every muscle tensed, trying to will myself invisible. The tapping stopped as soon as the light went out, and a stillness filled the room, making me feel like a cornered animal. For a moment, I thought he might be gone, but then I heard his voice again, closer than before, his tone growing sharper. "Come on, let me in. I just want to talk," he said, his words dripping with a mocking sweetness that felt anything but friendly. Without thinking, I turned and bolted from the converted bedroom, my feet barely making contact with the floor as I sprinted down the hallway to my own room. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and flung myself onto the bed, pulling the blankets over my head as if they could shield me from whatever was outside. I lay there, curled up in the dark, trying to quiet my breathing, listening for any sound that might indicate he'd followed me to the other side of the house. Every small noise, the rustle of leaves outside, the faint creak of the house settling, felt amplified, as if he were moving through the shadows, coming closer. Minutes felt like hours as I hid, feeling trapped in my own home, too afraid to turn on any lights or even peek out from under the blankets. The fear had seeped into me, cold and unshakable, each second stretching out as I waited for my parents to come home. I kept imagining him standing just outside my room, that same mocking smile on his face, knowing I was trapped inside, helpless. At some point, I heard the faint rumble of my parents' car pulling into the driveway, headlights briefly illuminating the wall through the gap in my curtains. Relief flooded over me, but I didn't move until I heard the front door open and the familiar sound of my parents' voices carrying through the house. Only then did I crawl out from under the blankets, my legs shaking as I stumbled out to meet them, trying to act like everything was normal. I wanted to tell them what had happened, but my fear of getting in trouble for staying up late held me back. I kept it to myself, convincing myself that maybe I'd imagined parts of it. The next few nights, I couldn't bring myself to go back into that converted bedroom, and every little noise around the house made me jump. I checked the locks on every door and window, sometimes multiple times, the memory of that man's voice, "Let me in, love," echoing in my mind. Even years later, the thought of that night makes my skin crawl, a reminder of how vulnerable I'd felt in a place that was supposed to be safe. It was the last time I ever felt fully comfortable being alone in that house. I had been hiking down from the mesa for a while, my legs a little sore from the day's trek. The descent in near darkness added a new element of tension to the solitude, as each step echoed in the stillness around me. It was an unusually clear night, and while the stars provided some faint light overhead, the trail itself was cloaked in deep shadows, the terrain almost unrecognizable in the dim glow of my headlamp. The batteries were nearly dead, so I'd switched to red mode to save what little life was left, and to preserve my night vision. The soft red light was just enough to illuminate the path directly in front of me, but it cast the landscape around me in dark, vague shapes that felt almost like shadows moving on their own. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of the rocks and sparse vegetation along the trail, but beyond that, everything faded into darkness. As I walked, I found myself focusing on the subtle, rhythmic sounds of my own footsteps, trying to maintain a calm, steady pace. The night was so quiet that every sound felt amplified. The scrape of gravel underfoot, the occasional rattle of loose stones, and the faint crunch of dried leaves. I'd occasionally hear distant sounds, branches creaking in the breeze, the scurry of a small animal in the brush, but these felt natural, part of the forest settling into the quiet of night. About a mile into the descent, a strange sensation settled over me. It was like a prickling along the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. I paused, trying to brush it off, telling myself it was just nerves and the disorienting effect of hiking alone at night. I adjusted my backpack and took a few deep breaths, feeling a bit silly for letting my imagination get the best of me. But as I continued, the sensation only grew stronger. I'd glance back over my shoulder every so often, scanning the darkness behind me, but each time I turned, the red glow of my headlamp only revealed more of the same. A winding trail, rocks, and shadows. By now, I was checking behind me so frequently that I'd started to lose my focus on the trail ahead, tripping over roots and rocks that seemed to materialize out of nowhere in the dim light. I could feel my pulse quicken, my senses hyper-aware of every tiny sound around me. I convinced myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the eerie stillness. But the feeling of being watched persisted, unrelenting. It was as if there was something moving with me, staying just outside my line of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. Finally, after what must have been the fourth or fifth time I felt that intense sense of being watched, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stopped dead in my tracks, took a steadying breath, and switched my headlamp from the red mode to full white light. The bright, blinding beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the path behind me in stark, almost shocking detail compared to the murky red light I'd been relying on. And that's when I saw it, just beyond the reach of my light, maybe 25 yards back. A shape moved quickly behind a cluster of bushes. It was low to the ground, gliding smoothly, too fast and quiet for any animal I could identify. The movement was subtle, a fleeting shadow, but unmistakable. In that split second, I knew something had been following me, staying just far enough away to remain hidden in the shadows. Seeing that shadow slip behind the bushes sent a jolt of fear through me. My mind raced as I processed what I'd just seen, smooth, fast, and low to the ground. It wasn't a deer, and certainly not any small animal. I stood there, my headlamp on high, scanning the area where the shape had disappeared, but all I could see were bushes and shadows cast by my shaky beam of light. My heart pounded in my chest as I considered my options, but the truth was, I didn't have many. I was deep on the trail with no quick way out and a dwindling battery in my headlamp. Turning back would take longer, and staying put didn't feel like an option. I knew my best choice was to keep moving, to make myself appear confident and as unafraid as possible. In a moment of shaky resolve, I tried to make myself look bigger. I spread my arms, letting my rain jacket billow slightly to add bulk to my silhouette, and held my hiking stick high, hoping that whatever was out there would see me as more of a threat than prey. I cleared my throat, yelled out a few words into the dark, hoping the sound would scare it off, or at least make it reconsider approaching any closer. The echoes of my voice faded quickly, swallowed up by the vast silence of the mesa, and the only reply was the eerie stillness of the night. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts, and started walking again, this time making deliberate noise, stepping harder on the gravel to announce my presence. Switching my headlamp back to red mode felt like a risk, but I knew I had no other choice. The bright white beam was draining the battery quickly, and I needed whatever light I could save for the rest of the descent. The red light was faint, casting a dim glow just enough to light the trail directly in front of me, leaving everything else swallowed by darkness. With every step, my nerves were on high alert, my ears straining to hear any hint of movement behind me. About 10 minutes later, I glanced back over my shoulder, switching the headlamp to white mode briefly, and saw them. Two greenish eyes glowing back at me from about 25 yards away, low to the ground and completely still. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse quickening as I recognized the telltale reflection of animal eyeshine. The size and height didn't fit that of a deer, and it certainly wasn't moving like one either. The eyes held steady, watching me, unblinking, as I quickly turned back to my path and kept moving. I could feel them on me, even when I wasn't looking, the sensation of being observed growing stronger. I forced myself to keep a steady pace, gripping my hiking stick tightly, the wooden handle reassuring but hardly comforting against the possibility of what might be out there. Every few minutes I would stop, take a deep breath, and turn around, hitting the white light again. Each time I'd catch the same pair of green eyes in the darkness, always at the same distance, as if it were keeping pace, close enough to monitor me, but never approaching. It was following me, and though I tried to tell myself it was out of curiosity rather than malice, the idea didn't calm me. Mountain lions were rare, but not unheard of, and I knew well enough that if it were one, it could easily close that gap in seconds. The worst part was the helplessness, knowing that I had no way to outrun it, no way to outmaneuver something so agile and stealthy. With each turn of my head, I saw those eyes again, holding their ground in the shadows, and a primal sense of dread began to settle in. The wilderness, usually a place of peace for me, had turned into a silent, lurking presence, waiting to see what I would do. With every turn, every glimpse of those steady green eyes glinting back at me, I could feel my initial fear solidifying into something much deeper, a raw awareness of my vulnerability out here on the darkened mesa. I kept moving, my body tensed, walking in measured steps, reminding myself to stay calm. I picked up my pace slightly, doing my best to project confidence, even though every nerve was screaming at me to get out of there. I knew that running would only trigger a predator's instincts, and the last thing I wanted was to be seen as prey. To keep myself grounded, I pulled out my phone and called a friend, explaining my situation as calmly as I could. I told him where I was, described the trail, and explained that if I didn't make it back within an hour, he'd know where to look for me. My voice was steadier than I felt, and hearing my friend on the other end encouraging me to stay calm gave me a small sense of reassurance. Talking out loud felt like a lifeline, cutting through the silence and offering a shred of normalcy, even as my eyes continued to flick back toward the shadows. Every so often, I'd switch the headlamp back to full white light to check behind me, and each time, I'd catch sight of those eyes, watching me from the same distance. They never came closer, but they never let up either, as if the creature was studying my every move, assessing me with a detached, predatory focus. It was strange, almost surreal. The eyes remained at a constant distance, always low to the ground, and though I wanted to believe it might be some other animal, the stealth and persistence convinced me otherwise. Deer or other small animals wouldn't follow someone for miles, and they certainly wouldn't be crouched so low. The trail felt longer than usual as I made my way down, each step heavy with a sense of urgency tempered only by my need to remain composed. The air grew colder, and the red glow from my headlamp seemed to dim with each passing minute. I could feel the battery nearing its end, flickering slightly, and knew that I was running out of time. The thought of having to navigate the final stretch of the trail in complete darkness was daunting, but I kept moving, my grip tightening on the hiking stick I'd found earlier, every step feeling like a test of willpower. When I finally reached the bottom of the mesa and stepped off the trail, I realized that the green eyes had vanished. I hadn't seen them in the last few minutes, but I hadn't fully registered their absence until I felt the flatness of open ground beneath me, signaling that I was in the fields. A wave of relief washed over me, though I remained cautious, scanning the edges of the field just in case. I paused, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and took a moment to steady myself, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. As my headlamp finally gave out, I hiked the last stretch back through the fields without any light, guided by the faint starlight overhead. The silence felt different now, a little less oppressive, though the unease lingered. I knew I had likely been in a mountain lion's territory, wandering too close at a time when it was out to hunt, and I could only guess that it had been more curious than aggressive, assessing me from the shadows. Still, the experience of being followed, of knowing that I was being watched and trailed by something unseen, left a lasting impression. By the time I made it back to safety, the forest around me felt altered, no longer the peaceful solitude I had once enjoyed, but a reminder of the wild, unpredictable nature of the wilderness. Though I told myself I'd probably just intruded on the mountain lion's territory, and that it had likely lost interest once I'd left its hunting ground, the memory of those green eyes stalking me through the night is something I won't soon forget. It was a rare, unsettling glimpse into the wild's quiet power, and an experience that would forever change the way I moved through places where I was truly alone. It was my friend's 16th birthday, and his family's property made for the perfect party spot. Sprawling fields, a big backyard, and, most notably, a vast stretch of forest behind the house that seemed to go on forever. As the night wore on, the gathering had shifted outside, with people clustering around the backyard, the porch lights casting warm pools of light. But just beyond that line of light was the tree line, stretching into dark, dense woods that were almost pitch black under the clear night sky. The idea to play murder in the dark in the woods came up as a way to make the night memorable. And before we knew it, everyone was gathering flashlights, ready for an adventure. My friend and I decided to go all out with our hiding spot, and we spotted a ladder propped against his dad's shed. We figured if we dragged it deep enough into the woods and climbed up a tall tree, we could pull the ladder up behind us and hide in the branches, making us nearly impossible to find. It seemed like a brilliant plan. There was no way anyone would think to look up, and we'd be well hidden from anyone below. We grabbed the ladder, exchanging grins as we prepared to haul it into the darkened forest. The it person started counting down from 100, and everyone scattered in all directions, their flashlights bobbing through the darkness. My friend and I hefted the ladder between us, each gripping one end, and started making our way toward the trees. It was awkward and heavy, the metal cold against our hands, and it clanked softly every time we set it down to adjust our grip. We joked about how this would be the ultimate hiding spot, laughing quietly as we made our way into the woods. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. At first, we could still hear the distant sounds of people talking and the faint counting echoing from the backyard, but with each step, the woods seemed to close in, swallowing those familiar sounds. The ground beneath us was uneven, and the ladder kept catching on low branches and tangled roots, slowing us down. The trees around us grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead and blocking out most of the moonlight, so we relied on the faint glow of the porch lights in the distance as we maneuvered through the undergrowth. As we moved further in, I became aware of just how different the woods felt at night. The shadows were dense, stretching out between the trunks and creating odd shapes that seemed to shift as we walked. Every so often, we'd stop to catch our breath and listen, adjusting our grip on the ladder and exchanging quiet whispers about how far in we'd gone. Occasionally, we could hear a rustle or snap somewhere off in the distance, but mostly it was just the two of us in the vast, dark silence of the woods, each step making it harder to hear the sounds of the others. We were probably a good few minutes into the forest by then, far enough that the voices and counting had faded to a muffled background noise. We stopped to scan the trees around us, searching for one with branches low enough to climb, but each one seemed to loom above us, just out of reach. The excitement from earlier was starting to give way to something else, a sense that we'd gone far enough, maybe a little too far. The dark seemed thicker out here, and even though we hadn't heard anyone else near us, I felt a prickling awareness of just how isolated we were. Standing in the dense, silent woods, my friend and I shared a look of confusion. The usual night sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, had disappeared completely, leaving an odd, heavy stillness in the air. It was as if the forest itself had gone quiet, holding its breath. We could barely make out the counting now, though we hadn't gone as far as it seemed. The faint voices and laughter from the backyard sounded muted, distant, like they were on the other side of a wall. I felt a prickling unease settle over me, and I could tell my friend felt it too. As we adjusted our grip on the ladder, we were startled by a new sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, coming from somewhere deep in the woods ahead of us. It was faint at first, but it had a steady beat, almost like footsteps or the hooves of a galloping horse. The noise was strange, nothing like the forest sounds we were used to hearing. We stopped in our tracks, straining to listen, both of us turning toward the source of the sound. The thumping continued, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to reverberate through the trees, growing louder and closer with each beat. For a moment, we stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what we were hearing. The sound was getting louder, each beat more pronounced, echoing through the stillness of the forest. As we listened, it seemed to take on an almost mechanical quality, too even, too controlled to be an animal, but nothing that sounded familiar either. I glanced at my friend, who was looking just as confused as I was. In the darkness, I could barely make out his face, but I could tell his eyes were wide, his grip on the ladder tight as he listened. Then, through the trees in front of us, we noticed a faint glow. At first, I thought it might be someone's flashlight, but the light was different, soft, almost flickering, like it was moving through the trees. It was a warm, orangey light, casting shadows that danced across the ground as it moved. We couldn't see a clear source, but it was definitely coming closer, weaving its way through the forest, accompanied by the rhythmic thumping. The combination of the strange light and the growing thumping sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My friend and I stood there, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen. The sound was loud now, close enough that we should have been able to see whatever was making it. I whispered, asking if he had any idea what it was, but he just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the spot where the light seemed to be coming from. Neither of us moved, gripped by a shared sense of dread that had crept up on us without warning. Suddenly, the light seemed to shift, moving faster, as if it was aware of our presence. The thumping grew louder, more intense, like it was heading directly toward us. It was in that moment, that instant of rising panic, that we knew we had to get out of there. Without a word, we dropped the ladder, its metallic clang echoing briefly before being swallowed up by the silence. We didn't look back as we turned and bolted, sprinting through the forest, desperate to put as much distance between us and that sound as possible. When we burst out of the woods, our breath ragged and hearts pounding, the rest of the group turned to stare, startled by the panic on our faces. We quickly told everyone about the rhythmic thumping and strange light moving through the trees, half expecting them to laugh it off. But my friend's dad, who was among the adults hanging around the backyard, didn't seem amused. He raised an eyebrow, giving us a look that was both skeptical and concerned, then told us to go back and retrieve his ladder. His tone was firm. We'd borrowed it without asking, after all, and it wasn't cheap. So, with some reluctance, we rallied the rest of the group and armed ourselves with flashlights. The group of 20, mostly joking and egging each other on, formed a loose line as we made our way back into the woods, retracing our steps. Having everyone around made me feel braver, but there was still a weight in the air that felt different, almost as if the woods were holding their breath again. The group was louder this time, with flashlights casting long beams across the trees, bouncing shadows with every step. We walked deeper, the beams of our flashlights sweeping across the dense undergrowth and catching brief glimpses of familiar markers. The twisted branch we had passed, the large rock near where we'd stopped. The forest felt even darker than before, and the heavy silence seemed to press down on us as we moved further in. Although the others were chatting and laughing, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was observing us from somewhere just beyond the reach of our lights. Eventually, we came to the small clearing where we had abandoned the ladder. But instead of lying where we'd dropped it, we found it standing upright in the center of the clearing, perfectly set up as though someone had carefully placed it there. The sight stopped all of us in our tracks. The ladder wasn't just standing up, it was soaking wet, glistening as though it had been left out in the rain. But the night had been clear, and there was no explanation for how it could be dripping like that. I could hear murmurs and nervous laughter ripple through the group, but everyone's faces betrayed the same unease. A few people crept closer, reaching out to touch it as if to confirm it was real. The metal was cold and damp, like it had been dunked in water, and a few people's hands came away wet, leaving them wiping their palms on their clothes in discomfort. We stood around the ladder in an uneasy silence, each of us exchanging uncertain glances. There was an unspoken agreement that no one wanted to be the last to leave the clearing, so we quickly turned around and started heading back, this time moving a lot faster. As we made our way back to the edge of the woods, a strange feeling of relief washed over me, the tension slowly dissipating with each step toward the open field. When we finally broke out of the tree line, the house lights seemed brighter, more welcoming, like a safe haven. No one spoke about what we'd seen or heard, as if putting it into words would make it real. To this day, none of us can explain what happened in the woods that night, and we've never tried going back in after dark. The memory of that strange, rhythmic thumping and the sight of the wet ladder standing alone in the clearing have stuck with us, a mystery we all silently agreed we'd rather leave unsolved. It was a slow night, and I'd been going through the usual routine, wiping down counters and restocking supplies to pass the time. Just when I thought the shift would end quietly, a man walked in. He looked to be in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with a calm, friendly expression that made him stand out right away. He was dressed in a casual but neat way, a dark jacket over a collared shirt, and had this slight smile on his face, like he was genuinely happy to be there. He approached the counter with a casual confidence, greeting me with a polite, "Good evening," which felt oddly formal but pleasant. Without any hesitation, he struck up a conversation, mentioning he'd spent years in LA working as a music producer. He talked about the artists he'd worked with, about the energy of the city back in the day, and how much the industry had shifted over the years. He seemed to enjoy sharing his experiences, going into detail about sessions he'd been a part of and places he'd traveled for work. His stories weren't generic, they had this personal touch, and he spoke with the kind of familiarity that made it feel like he was letting me in on something special. Each time I had to pause to serve another customer, he'd step back politely, giving me space, then pick up the conversation as soon as I was done. I noticed how attentive he was, looking me in the eye with each "thank you" or "please," nodding at my responses and asking questions here and there, as though he genuinely valued my input. His presence felt respectful, even warm, and I remember feeling grateful to have such an engaging and polite customer, especially on a night that had been so quiet. We talked about music for what must have been close to 15 or 20 minutes, and I was surprised at how easy it was to keep up the conversation. He had a way of drawing you in, making each story feel vibrant and real, and the rhythm of our conversation felt relaxed, almost like chatting with an old friend. Occasionally he'd laugh at his own stories, this low, genuine chuckle, and it felt contagious. It was refreshing to have a customer who wasn't in a rush, who seemed happy to just enjoy the moment. I could tell he was used to talking with people, used to being in charge of a room without having to force it. As more customers came in, I had to break away to take their orders, but he didn't seem bothered at all. I noticed he'd occasionally look around, smiling faintly as if observing the other customers, or he'd stand quietly, seeming lost in thought. When I finished with the orders and came back to him, he'd quickly refocus, resuming our conversation right where we'd left off. For a second, I wondered what had brought him in so late, why he was spending so much time here alone. But he was so calm, so polite, that it seemed more like curiosity than anything else. As I continued helping other customers, I noticed that the man's demeanor had started to change. What had been a calm, friendly presence just moments ago had shifted into something else. He was no longer standing quietly, waiting for me to return to our conversation. Instead, I saw him sitting at a nearby table, his posture slightly hunched over, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. He started murmuring to himself, his lips moving rapidly, in a way that seemed disconnected from the calm man I had spoken to earlier. At first, I thought he was just thinking out loud, maybe recalling a memory, but the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. His murmuring grew more pronounced, and though I couldn't make out the words, I could hear a strange rhythm to it, like he was repeating something over and over. I tried to keep my focus on the other customers, but my attention kept drifting back to him. He'd occasionally let out a soft laugh, as though responding to something only he could hear. The first couple of times, it seemed harmless, almost like he was lost in a pleasant memory. But as the minutes passed, his laughter became louder, sharper, and edged with something that didn't feel quite right. There was a shift in the energy around him, and I could feel it in the room, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced. His laughter, once friendly, took on an eerie, almost maniacal tone. He wasn't talking to me anymore. He wasn't even aware of the other customers or his surroundings. His gaze was unfocused, and his face began to contort into strange expressions, as if he was reacting to a conversation happening entirely in his own mind. His laughter echoed through the room, making the few remaining customers glance around nervously. I could see them shifting in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, their eyes darting toward the door as if considering leaving. Then, without warning, his murmuring escalated into a full-blown rant. He started shouting about the world, his voice rising and falling in strange, unpredictable pitches, his words jumbled and frantic. At times, he was barely audible, almost whispering under his breath, but then he'd suddenly burst into loud, disjointed sentences, his voice echoing off the walls. His face twisted into disturbing expressions, one second grinning widely, the next scowling with a kind of anger that didn't seem directed at anyone in particular. I watched as two customers quietly stood up, abandoning their unfinished meals as they slipped out the door, clearly unnerved by his erratic behavior. The other remaining patrons looked at me expectantly, as if I was supposed to do something. My heart was racing, but I felt paralyzed. I kept hoping the man would calm down, that this would pass like some strange momentary episode, but it only seemed to escalate. His rant was unpredictable, his voice going from low growls to high-pitched shrieks, and his face constantly shifting between wild expressions. Each pitch of his voice seemed to vibrate through the room, amplifying the tension that hung in the air. At that moment, I realized that I needed to act. I reached for the phone, trying to keep my movements slow and steady as I dialed the police. I explained the situation in a low voice, glancing over at the man, who was now rocking slightly in his seat, still lost in his increasingly disturbing monologue. I didn't know what had triggered this shift, but whatever was happening, it was clear that the polite man I had spoken to earlier was now gone, replaced by someone entirely unpredictable. As I waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. The man continued his erratic behavior, completely unaware of the quiet chaos he was causing. After what felt like an eternity, the police finally arrived, their presence bringing a momentary sense of relief. But as soon as the officers entered, the man's entire demeanor shifted. It was like a switch had flipped. The wild expressions, the erratic movements, and the manic laughter all disappeared in an instant. He straightened up, smoothed his jacket, and looked at the officers with an expression of calm respect. His eyes, which had moments before seemed so unfocused and distant, suddenly sharpened, zeroing in on them with a kind of polite acknowledgement. He stood up from the table slowly, his movements deliberate, and turned to face the officers, as if he'd been expecting them all along. The officers approached him cautiously, glancing at me for confirmation. I nodded, signaling that he was the one they were there for, but inside, I was stunned at how quickly he'd changed. The man who'd just been raving and shouting to himself now greeted them with a pleasant smile and nodded in understanding when they asked him to step outside. There was no resistance, no hesitation. He even spoke to them in the same polite, friendly tone he'd used when he'd first come in, as if the outburst we'd all witnessed hadn't happened at all. Watching him, it was hard to believe that this was the same person who had been frightening everyone only moments earlier. As he walked toward the door, one of the officers placed a hand on his shoulder, guiding him. He complied with ease, hands by his sides, projecting an air of total calm. Just before he stepped outside, though, he paused and turned back, his eyes meeting mine across the room. For a brief moment, his face softened into a look that I couldn't quite interpret, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then he gave me a quick wink. It was such a small gesture, but something about it sent a chill down my spine. The wink felt deliberate, as though he was acknowledging some kind of shared secret, something only the two of us understood. It left me with the unsettling feeling that everything he'd done had been intentional, a performance with me as his audience. As soon as the door closed behind them, the room felt oddly still, like it was holding its breath. The few remaining patrons exchanged anxious glances, each one visibly shaken, and slowly began to filter out, some leaving their orders unfinished. I stood behind the counter, feeling a strange blend of relief and dread. Working late shifts at the club, I'd gotten used to the long, quiet journey back home every night. After hours of loud music, flashing lights, and the energy of the crowd, the shift always ended the same way, cleaning up, shutting down, and locking up. It was an oddly calm process, the energy draining from the club as the last patrons left, and then the final, predictable routine of saying goodnight to coworkers before heading out into the early morning silence. I'd catch my bus, where there were rarely more than a few people on board, and watch the empty streets pass by as I waited for my stop. Once off the bus, the last leg of my trip was a 10-minute walk through quiet, dimly lit streets. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, just a mix of closed-up shops, apartment buildings, and rows of parked cars. At that hour, everything felt deserted, with only the glow of streetlights casting patches of light and shadow along the way. I'd gotten so used to the quiet that I'd started seeing the walk as an extension of my shift, a predictable cool-down from the energy of the club. Most nights, I'd put my headphones in as soon as I stepped off the bus, choosing familiar songs to pass the time and help me unwind. My mind would drift as I walked, the music drowning out the silence and adding a sense of rhythm to the stillness. I'd walk under each streetlight, the dim glow briefly lighting up the sidewalk in front of me, with stretches of darkness in between. Occasionally, I'd spot a stray cat darting between cars or see a curtain flutter in a window above, but it was rare to see another person at that hour. It was just me, the empty sidewalks, and my music. The routine felt safe, almost like a ritual. After a few months, I barely thought about it, knowing I'd reach home without any interruptions. I'd memorized every corner, every streetlight, every bit of graffiti on the walls I passed. It was a stretch of familiarity in an otherwise unpredictable job, and I'd gotten comfortable with the silence, with being the only one out there, moving through a world that felt completely shut down. Halfway through my walk, I spotted someone in the distance, illuminated by one of the streetlights up ahead. At first, I couldn't make out much, just a figure standing still, like he was waiting for something. As I got a little closer, I saw him pacing back and forth, his head moving in quick, jerky movements, like he was searching for someone or talking to himself. I instinctively slowed down, pulling out my headphones, and the sudden silence felt heavy, pressing in on me. I could just barely hear his voice, muttering low, a strange rhythm to his words that didn't make sense. The street around us was completely empty, and his figure under the harsh yellow glow of the streetlight made the whole scene feel eerie. The closer I got, the stranger he looked. His movements were erratic, quick, and tense, like he was on edge, each step sharp and purposeful. As I continued walking, trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach, he turned toward me, his eyes catching me from under the dim light. He just stared, his expression intense, almost too focused, like he was trying to figure something out. The street around us was silent, no cars, no people, just the two of us in a quiet, dimly lit stretch of road. The way he looked at me was different from any passing glance or casual look. It was fixed, and there was something in his gaze that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For a second, I thought about crossing to the other side of the street, but I didn't want to draw any more attention to myself, so I kept moving, forcing myself to stay calm. I tried to look straight ahead, pretending not to notice him, hoping he'd go back to his pacing and let me pass without any trouble. But as soon as I was close enough to hear his muttering clearly, he froze completely, his body going stiff, still watching me. I could hear my own heartbeat, my senses on high alert, and I felt that raw instinct kick in, like my body knew something wasn't right long before I could fully process it. Then, in a sudden burst, he started running toward me, his footsteps loud in the still night air, and he was shouting, "Where's my brother? Where's my brother?" He screamed, his voice frantic, and each word echoing off the empty buildings around us. His shouts cut through the silence, and the sound was so jarring in the quiet that for a split second, I froze, panic flooding over me. His voice was desperate, angry, like he was pleading and accusing all at once, his words hitting me with a sense of urgency that made my skin crawl. Without thinking, I turned and started running in the opposite direction, my legs pushing hard, my breaths quick and shallow. I could hear him behind me, his shouts and footsteps heavy, getting louder as he chased me down the empty street. The neighborhood I walked every night, usually so quiet and familiar, now felt foreign, like I was trapped in a place I didn't recognize. Each block stretched out endlessly, and every time I rounded a corner, I could still hear him shouting, his voice bouncing off the walls, making it sound like he was around every corner, just a few steps behind. As I ran, I couldn't help but glance back, catching a glimpse of his shadowy figure in the distance, still running after me, his voice loud and echoing. The streetlights overhead felt too dim, casting long shadows that distorted everything, making each alley and side street feel like a trap. My mind raced, my focus narrowing to just getting as far from him as possible, each step fueled by the adrenaline flooding my system. When I finally made it inside my building, I didn't allow myself to relax until I'd locked the door behind me, double-checking the deadbolt. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, listening to the silence of the empty hallway, letting the familiar surroundings sink in. My hands were still shaking as I leaned back against the door, trying to calm down and reassure myself that I was finally safe. My mind kept racing with everything that had just happened. The man's shouts, the heavy footfalls on the empty street, the way his voice had echoed off the buildings around us, making it sound like he was closer than he was. It was almost like those sounds had followed me into the building, and I couldn't quite shake the feeling that he might still be out there, lurking somewhere in the shadows. I took a few deep breaths, hoping to steady myself, but even in the comfort of my building, I felt a lingering unease that I couldn't brush off. As I made my way to my apartment, I found myself checking over my shoulder, my ears straining for any sound from outside. Even the soft click of the elevator doors and the faint hum of machinery felt exaggerated, my senses heightened from the adrenaline. When I finally got to my apartment door, I quickly locked it, taking another moment to check the windows and make sure everything was secure. The usual routine felt different that night, almost like I was seeing my home through a new lens, my comfort replaced by a wariness I couldn't shake. Later, as I lay in bed, I found it impossible to sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, wondering what might have happened if he'd caught up to me, if I hadn't been quick enough to get away. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd picture him under that streetlight, his eyes locking onto mine, or hear his voice shouting, "Where's my brother?" like it was coming from right outside. Every small noise in my apartment, Every creak of the floor or faint sound from the street below made me tense up, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. I even considered moving away from the window, but I couldn't help myself from occasionally glancing outside as if he might somehow be there. The next morning, the walk to work felt different too. The daylight helped, but I found myself checking over my shoulder, taking in every face I passed, a sense of vigilance sticking with me even as people bustled by, oblivious. By the time my shift ended that night, I had already decided to make changes to my walk home. I kept only one headphone in, the other tucked safely away, and my pace was faster, each step deliberate as I scanned the street around me. I noticed myself sticking closer to the streetlights, crossing the road if I saw anyone else up ahead, choosing paths that would keep me visible, even if it meant taking a slightly longer route. The quiet that I used to find relaxing after a shift now made me feel exposed, the stillness unsettling rather than comforting. With each passing night, my vigilance became habit. I carried my keys in my hand, ready to use them if necessary, and took a mental inventory of places I could duck into if something felt off. Convenience stores, late-night diners, anywhere with people. I even found myself avoiding certain corners, particularly the one where I'd first seen the man, memories of his face under that dim light flashing in my mind. It was as if that one encounter had reprogrammed the way I navigated familiar streets, making me cautious in a way I hadn't been before. Months later, even in daylight, I'd catch myself tensing up if I noticed someone acting strangely on the street, and my instinct was to put distance between us. I'd never been one to worry much about safety on my walk home, but now I found myself mapping every route, assessing each street's visibility, and staying close to areas with foot traffic. That single night changed everything about my routine, a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, a sense of safety could quickly turn into something else entirely. If you want to hear more, check our playlist of stories.